to you on it.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Jim, and welcome everyone to another cannabis-focused event. I'm in the city today, and it's just really exciting times in the industry. I'm having meetings with people from California, from Europe, that are kind of in town, and there's a lot of growth and consolidation talks happening, and so it's a very interesting time. One of the key focus areas we'll cover today is the Senate proposed bill on cannabis legalization. Things like how likely is it to pass, which parts are likely to make progress, which ones are not, what does it imply for different players in the industry, both locally as well as internationally. If nothing else, it's a pretty big statement and headline to the world that the U.S. is serious about looking at legalizing cannabis. So I'll give just a few format notes. We will try to introduce each of the panelists. They will have about 5 to 7 minutes to kind of talk about their background and who they are, as well as any slides or commentary they would like to make. After that, we will have a panel discussion. I'll be asking some questions, and feel free, any of the moderators, to jump in and ask questions as well. And even panelists are welcome to ask questions of each other. We try to make this a very lively discussion. The goal is to educate people about what's happening in the cannabis space and highlight some of the themes and operators and experienced executives that have. So without kind of further ado, I will start the call on the panelists. As most people know, I try to give everybody equivalent time. If somebody's kind of running over.
We can't hear you.
Anand, your voice has cut off. We cannot hear you.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's a little better.
Okay, apologies. I think the internet is slightly choppy. So I'll turn it over first to Chris Crane, who is joining us for the panel. Thank you, Chris. I know it was last minute that we asked you to join, but appreciate you coming on, given your background on the regulatory front. So if you could give a quick intro and then just kind of overall thoughts and any commentary that you might have about what's taking place at the federal level would be appreciated.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me, Anand. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Chris Crane. I am the president and co-founder of Forefront Ventures. We're a publicly traded multi-state operator in the United States, operating across the entire vertical. And I have a long background in the policy world prior to joining the industry, and throughout my past decade plus in the industry, I had worked with NORML in Washington, D.C. I was the executive director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and I'm still the vice chair of the board of directors of the National Cannabis Industry Association, so have a firm foot in the advocacy and policy world. So to that end, I was asked to talk a bit about the Senate proposal, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, or at least familiar that it exists. It's a extremely comprehensive piece of legislation, and really the first of its kind ever introduced in the U.S. Congress to fully legalize, tax, and regulate cannabis at the federal level. There was a bill last year that passed the House, the MORE Act, which would have legalized cannabis at the federal level, but didn't really get much into detail on the regulatory side of things in terms of who would regulate it, how it would be taxed. So this proposal is much more comprehensive than anything that we've seen. I'll run through just some of the high level points about it, and then give you sort of my outlook on where things are going. So at the very high level of this bill, it would remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act within 60 days of being enacted. So that would be terrific. It would put regulation in the hands of multiple agencies, but primarily in the hands of the FDA. Although TTB would also have a pretty major regulatory role, including collecting taxes, particularly on collecting taxes and tracking and tracing enforcement of marijuana products. There's some fairly strong social equity components to the bill, including grants that we provided to business owners that come from disproportionately harmed communities. The tax rate set in the bill is fairly controversial, in large part because it's pretty high, and there's some real concern about whether or not it would be so high as to make it difficult to eliminate the illicit market. Taxes would start at 10% for the first year after the bill is enacted. This would be a sales tax, I should say, and that will go up by 5% each year for the first 4 years of the program. So it would increase up to 25% sales tax. Then in the 5th year after enactment, the tax would become, I'll just quote this because I don't know if there's any way to really paraphrase, a per ounce or per milligram of THC amount determined by the Secretary of the Treasury equal to 25% of the prevailing price of cannabis sold in the United States in the prior year. So basically it'll go up to 25% and then that'll all be reassessed as a THC potency tax. Small businesses, meaning businesses that make less than $20 million a year in annual sales, will be eligible for a 50% reduction in their tax rate via a tax credit. I'll mostly leave it there. I mean, there's quite a bit about, the FDA oversees some of it, the TTB controls some of it. Treasury is going to be involved in anybody who is distributing cannabis across state lines. It does, I should say, explicitly allow for interstate commerce, but it does not require that states themselves legalize on their own. And so it does say that if a state makes cannabis or has cannabis remain illegal and another state has it legal, it would still be federally illegal to export from a legal state to an illegal state. However, a state could not prohibit interstate commerce if it's legal in their state coming from another legal state. So it's a lot to work out, somewhat complicated. That's the overview of what the legislation says. Now, the reality is this bill will not pass this year. Right. I mean, I hate to throw cold water on it. I hope that I'm wrong, but I'm not. This bill, I do not believe will qualify for reconciliation, meaning that it would need 60 votes to pass in the Senate. And the reality right now is that we do not have 50 votes to pass it. So even if you could get it through reconciliation, there are not 50 votes right now in the United States Senate. A handful of Democrats have stated that they are opposed or likely opposed or undecided. And there's really only probably 2 Republicans right now, maybe 3 Republicans that have indicated, not even indicated, that might possibly be a yes vote. And I think the tax rates in this probably eliminate somebody like Rand Paul, who would be our most likely Republican supporter because of his sort of libertarian leanings. I'm guessing in the end may come out opposed to this because of the taxes and the way that it's regulated. So very unlikely that this gets done this year. However, particularly for someone like myself who's been involved in this for 20 plus years, the fact that this exists is a tremendous milestone and incredibly important. It is the starting point for a real federal dialogue around what cannabis regulation will ultimately look like at the federal level in the United States. It is a starting point to make changes, to have these negotiations. Right? Controversial legislation or difficult legislation almost never passes on its first go round, so that shouldn't be surprising. But it needs to get introduced the first time in order for the sausage to be made, for changes to be made, for deals to be made, to get people who may be on the fence or may be reluctant to come around, right? So this is a starting point. It is possible that we'll see elements of this bill get passed as either standalone legislation or more likely included in larger spending bills. In a budget bill, you could see something like banking protections included in the budget or included in a larger omnibus spending bill later this year, or even passed on its own, although that's become somewhat controversial amongst particularly members of the left in the Democratic Party who have said they don't want to see banking unless comprehensive reform passes, which will make that more difficult as a standalone. But I still think there's a path forward for banking. I think that the Democratic leadership in the Senate needs to show that they are making a genuine and real push to get this passed. And if they do that and it still fails, then it is possible that we could see a more piecemeal approach to what I would call lower hanging fruit, things like banking reform, 280E reform, potentially sentencing reform, expungement, issues that would not be as difficult to garner Republican support as a larger comprehensive bill like this. The only sort of caution I'll leave with is, if this does not get done by the end of 2022, we're likely looking at a much longer time horizon to get a comprehensive piece of legislation like this passed. And that's because I am operating under the assumption that the Democrats will lose one, if not both, houses of Congress in the midterm elections. That is typically what happens to the party that holds the White House, and the lead, their lead in both houses is extremely small. So history would tell us that the Republicans will take back one, if not both, houses next year. And unfortunately today, this is, irregardless of my or anyone else's personal political beliefs, the Republican Party right now, particularly Republican leadership in the Senate, is not especially friendly to this issue. So I think the chances of us getting something like as comprehensive of this passed in the next session, should the Republicans take back one of the houses of Congress, becomes significantly smaller than it is right now, where it's already has a pretty small chance of passing. So I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions on this as we move forward, and I will leave it there and move on to the other panelists.
Thank you, Chris. That's a great overview of the current proposal and kind of some of the challenges in passing it in the form that it's in. So I'll just kind of share my screen here, and why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Sundy, next, and then I'll queue up your slides as you're presenting.
Great. So my name is Sundy, and I am with the Safe Harbor program, which was launched with Partner Colorado Credit Union 7 years ago, 2015. And we've been banking the industry since that time. We grew the portfolio methodically. We've recently split off all things cannabis into Safe Harbor Financial, into a subsidiary of Partner Colorado Credit Union, so we could isolate the risk a little better from the main membership and the credit union itself. So if you want to put my first slide up, that would be great.
Sure, give me 1 second here.
Okay. So just to give you an idea on how the market has grown, and this is just one credit union, and our asset size is about $600 million. So this is a major risk for the credit union that they undertook. We started in 2015 with $153 million for the total year, and we expect in our 7th year, actually probably closer to $4 billion of processing cannabis-related deposits. So, and when we talk about cannabis-related deposits, we're not only speaking about the actual sales, we're also talking about other deposits that service industry provides to the cannabis industry, because we hold the fact that if money laundering is going to happen, which is our major concern, it's probably going to happen in the ancillary accounts versus the actual sales and accounts that are holding the money, because there's too many validating points there that we can confirm that sales were made. So you see the big jump in 2019, and what happened in 2019 is that we started receiving tens of millions of dollars weekly from Canadian investors and from the Canadian Stock Exchange there as they were doing their reverse mergers. So that's when we really saw the activity start to come in, where we would have some of our licensees would actually have spent $2 million to get a license, and suddenly they were starting to sell for $50 million at that particular time. So we have continued to see an increase in investment activity through the years, but it's slowed down much more at this point in time. And if you go to my next slide, I'll speak to that one. Whoops, back up one. There you go. This I thought would be interesting to you because they talk about the tax rate and how strapped this industry is for capital. And here what you see is the depository activity over the last couple of years. I just took the last couple of years. In the red line, though, they're withdrawing an average of 97% of their funds on a monthly basis. It does not stay in their account, so they're using every dollar for operations at this point in time. And one of the reasons being is it's a highly taxed industry. So I can imagine if this federal regulation passes and they're going to add another tax burden on them, they're literally banking on their future at this point in time because the tax rate is so high in all the states, and we do bank several states at this point in time, and all the way from Hawaii over to Florida. So, we're seeing the industry from multi-state level as well, but they are definitely strapped for capital. Go to the next slide. So this is the real fear. When people talk about the Safe Banking Act, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end, the real fear is the Bank Secrecy Act. And this has always been with us, but because there's the black market history and because there are illicit dollars trying to make their way into the financial system, it is the financial institution's job to protect the financial system and block out any illicit dollars. So that's what we're looking for. It also speaks to the fact that we have to report transactions on a regular basis. So when we talk about the expense of banking the industry and what we do, and we're probably well over $300 million a month on an average at this point in time, we probably file 1,000 federal reports on a monthly basis. So when cannabis companies come in and say they don't want to pay the extra fees, those reports not only have to be filed manually by, their systems to help to put them in through FinCEN, but everyone has to be unique, or we can find ourselves in a lot of trouble with the regulators. And the fines that come out of FinCEN, they're fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So, and if you talk about, a fine per CTR or per report that was filed inaccurately, now we're really talking 1,000 reports a month and a fine tied to those reports. So the question is, why would we do this with that type of risk? And that's, again, we went in with such a safe and sound measure of taking compliance to the highest level, and we've actually been through 15 federal and state exams. Anybody else would have quit. If my team wasn't ready to walk out on me, I would have been surprised. But, they had to learn the industry. And as they've learned the industry on the regulator side, you're starting to see them understand it. But they had to figure out how we could bank that safe and sound. The FinCEN guidance that was issued in 2014 specifically says, this is guidance that shows financial institutions how to bank the marijuana business. So that's as close to permission as we actually got. The other thing we rely on is the fact that we've been doing this for our 7th year now. And is the possibility of prosecution there? Yeah, absolutely, the possibility is there. Because we are considered money laundering at the federal level, they could come in and prosecute the officers, and they could prosecute the board, and fine the organization, obviously. But they haven't done it, so the probability of doing it in our 7th year takes away some of our fear. And that is why you are starting to see, regardless of the Safe Banking Act, more financial institutions come to the table. I'm going to be flying out to meet with a $40 billion financial institution who's just decided this year they want to get into the cannabis business. We're starting to see a whole lot more of that at this point in time because the probability isn't as great now if you get into the business. When we went into it, everybody wanted the money banked. They wanted to learn the industry. Now everybody's getting a little more comfortable. Now we're just worried about those legacy funds. If you ever get with a bank and they're talking about processing all those legacy funds, I'll tell you that those people who have the legacy funds, they have $200 million. It was made, the money was made in the black market or a gray market arena, and now they're trying to get it into the system. Anyone who says that that's going to be easy or, that they're even touching that money, I can tell you I've had several of those calls in the last 7 years, and they usually only have one call with me because they cannot document that money. So that is a big risk always to be watching in terms of investing in cannabis businesses and what their bank is doing to protect the financial system. Do you want to go to the next slide? I won't talk about all of this, but I have kind of put these in an order of risk, labor, and expense, with legacy funds at the top, the most risky funds out there. And you see a lot of financial institutions, or you see these third-party fintechs saying, let's process that money because they can earn a lot of money processing legacy funds. And I've had people try to slip $5 million into an account saying, we can validate this. And the fact of the matter is, doesn't matter if you have a third-party fintech who tells you they can validate this money. If that money goes through your account, you are responsible as the financial institution for allowing those monies to get into the financial system. The reason investors see CRV sales way down at the bottom there, several points of validation, whether it's taxes, financial statements, or even the point-of-sale inventory systems and the reports that they make to the states. All of those give us points of validation for legitimate sales along with their licensing. Investor equity funds, that type of things, we have a special obligation when we see them. First of all, as the money comes into the financial institution, we have to know who's in that pool. It only takes one illicit investor to get into the pool to really harm all the investors in that pool. The second part of that is deploying those funds, and most financial institutions don't want to deploy those funds, so we've had a lot of these conversations. And the reason they don't want to deploy these funds is because you have to make sure it's going to a legitimately licensed entity, and they have to be in a compliant banking program as well. So you want to watch the money coming in the pool, and then you also want to see the money and where it's being deployed. So again, there's work involved, additional work involved for the financial institution taking any investment funds in. The same thing for lending. You know, it may be fine that you get the money into the pool and you loan it out and you get it to the companies, and they're legitimate companies, but how are you making sure the money coming back to the investors is not illicit money? So again, you really have to rely on the financial institution having a solid cannabis banking program to be watching that money. All of this, again, adds to the risk and the labor and the expense. So I think you're going to have to hit enter a couple times to get past those three. So let's go to the last slide. So legislation on the horizon, you know, is everybody waiting for SAFE Banking Act to pass? No, we just heard that. Probably won't pass, but, you know, it isn't going to be the end all for financial institutions getting into it, because there's enough of us who have survived this long at this point in time that they feel much more comfortable. You know, what will it change? The prosecution risk of officers on the board, right? This just takes one more risk away from me. And I will tell you that many financial institutions, the board is blocking because they want absolutely no responsibility. So it's an end-all subject going into the boardroom if you've got one board member who says, you know, we can't do this. It also will prevent, we're hoping, exclusion from the financial system. So we have Federal Reserve accounts all over the country. We're probably moving $9 million of cash, or mostly cash, throughout the country at any given time, but there's still one or two Federal Reserves that don't want to open accounts for us because we're actually processing cannabis money. And we have run into that in that situation. Most know that we have a proven program, so they're willing to work with us, but there's still some roadblocks out there. And the third thing I think it can do that's really going to be beneficial to the industry is that it would open insurance options. Like right now, if a financial institution goes into it and banks the cannabis money, there are exclusions, right, that it won't cover any actions against the financial institution that are cannabis related. Also, the major credit cards are not taking this money at this point in time, so I think it might open the door for financial institutions to have merchant processing with major credit cards and then other financial services. And what it won't change is the very slide I talked to you about, which is the Bank Secrecy Act obligations, and that's where the real fines come in. That is why financial institutions won't enter this. If you liken the obligation to banking casinos or money service businesses, you will find out whether financial institutions actually have a stomach to do that, and many don't. So you won't see a rush to action here. You will see certain financial institutions who know how to manage that type of risk actually move into it and do it well. And that concludes.
Thank you, Sundi. Appreciate that, viewpoint from a bank's perspective. And I love this slide in particular, just kind of laying out what might happen as the most likely part of this legislation makes progress. So I'll turn it over next to Maddox Swenson to give a quick intro, and then we'll do Jay, and then we'll launch into a discussion about how this bill is going to impact, or potential parts of it are going to impact, operators as well as investors. So go ahead, Maddox.
Thanks, Anand. Sundi, thanks for that detailed overview on both the broader kind of federal bill and impacts to banking. I run a venture fund focused on investments in technology and infrastructure, as well as branded consumer products. Prior to launching L2, I co-led M&A and investments at IAC. Portfolio companies include LeafLink, a soon-to-be announced deal on the consumer side, a consumer e-commerce marketplace within cannabis, branded products company called Ripple, based in Colorado, that makes popular product. It's a water-soluble THC powder that kind of solves dosing and delivery. And then fourth company in our portfolio is a company called Celebre that focuses on cellular agriculture, manufacturing cannabinoids via non-plant-based processes. So would love to just share kind of my overview, my thoughts on kind of the recent proposal that Schumer had put forth. I agree with Chris. I don't think this has any chance in passing, but it's a step in the right direction. I think one of the most important things that came out of this bill was the specificity of, incorporating a number of the different agencies that will need to weigh in. If we rewind back to 2018, when the Farm Bill passed, that I think, abject failure might be too strong of a word, but it really hampered the market from the perspective of there wasn't enough specificity and there wasn't enough detail around how the market would be regulated, which basically created a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity, which has prevented the market in CBD from functioning as well as it should be. Retailers are still loath to take non-ingestible or to take ingestible products. And so I think Schumer did a really good job. And I know folks were waiting, for the bill. He had been talking about it for a while, but it seems like he had engaged, in, pretty deep conversation, took his time to include all of the stakeholders that, will be important in regulating this market. Chris has alluded to, this is incredibly complex when it comes to banking, interstate commerce, social equity. This is not something that's going to be resolved overnight, but I think, it elevates the conversation, more, amplifies it on the national stage and gets people talking and moving in the right direction, which is great and a step in the right direction. I think still this is a states-led, movement, and I don't see that will slow down anytime soon. I think when you look at the kind of federal policy making versus the state policy making, state legislators generally are part-time employees of the state, and states need to balance budgets. So, in a state context, situations can arise where, politicians and legislators can trade something for cannabis legalization without kind of, a significant amount of, political pushback, whereas at the federal level, they don't deal with those dynamics in quite the same way. So I think we'll continue to see movement on the state side, increasing the size of the market. I think a byproduct of that is, the companies that are incumbents in the space, both on the production side and the retail side, as well as on the technology and ancillary side, will continue to strengthen, in those that have had access to capital have built scale will continue to get stronger without kind of the impending threat of, let's just call it, ex-cannabis competition entering the marketplace. So I think as far as the health of the industry goes, I think most would agree that this is a step in the right direction. I think getting some relief on banking, sometime within Biden's term would be a good thing and would certainly help drive efficiency for both the tech companies and the MSOs and plant touching companies. But I think and hopefully kind of with that we'll also include some social equity components. But I could see, to Chris's point, nothing passes by the midterms, but there's maybe a little bit more openness to an incremental approach where there's social equity components attached to some sort of Safe Banking Act. But I think all of those that are well positioned today are going to benefit from a little bit of a slower rollout in terms of broad federal regulation, where incumbents can kind of deepen and widen their moats given current positions.
Thank you, Maddox, for that viewpoint. And then last but not least, I'd like to queue up Jay Spall to introduce and give some comments as well. And then we'll open it up for group discussion in a minute. And I know there's so many directions we could go with this, so I'll ask a few kind of foundational questions, and then we'll let the audience participate as well. Go ahead, Jay.
Hi guys, I'm Jay Spall. I'm the Chief Science Officer at ALT, Advanced Liquid Technology. It's a CPG company and a technology company. This was great hearing Chris Sunday and Maddox speak, and I will kind of tie some of the science, product development, and innovation with the conversation that we're having thus far. Just a little bit briefly about my background and the company a bit. I've been in the cannabis space for over a decade now. Been part of from cultivation all the way to extraction, distillations, formulations, beverages, nano-emulsions, and then dove into the technology development side in parallel with product development. I think the points that were raised today were extremely crucial, very important, and highly educational. I learned a lot of new things. I think where the market currently stands is cannabis market has been operating similar to that of like a farmer's market. How the money is being collected, how it's being operated, the lack of banking. However, the size of the market is more representative of like a pharmaceutical industry, but it is not standardized as such as far as banking goes, as far as regulation goes, as far as the whole infrastructure goes. So I think there's a huge product development and standardization component to it. And depending on the type of company you're working with, the types of product you're making, our approach at ALT has been to standardize the product to a point where you have a consistent experience. I'll give a rough example. For an industry that is as large as cannabis already, or is going to be, and it's going to grow at an exponential rate, it is much more similar to that of a product like, say, Tylenol. When you go to a store and buy Tylenol or ibuprofen, you get 200 milligrams every time you get it. You don't get, one time it's going, this batch is, at 80% and you got 175 milligrams. This batch is 230 milligrams. I believe this is a very crucial component when it comes to laying out the infrastructure as far as the government goes, private companies goes, banking goes. I believe this is a major component that is adds discomfort to the physicians, to the teams that are trying to put all this together. So being kind of a bit on the front lines on the technological component of it, and very happy to be with an amazing company and team like ALT, because our strategy is to do precision dosing where the consumer is one very comfortable and they know kind of what they're getting, right? So, and also the physicians are happy with it. Then we have conversations with individuals like yourselves who can kind of add this to their profile and understanding that which way the product development is moving. I'd also like to add one comment that, the cannabis industry is competing kind of with the pharmaceutical industry and also the alcohol industry. Us being in the beverage space, the non-alcoholic space, the cannabis beverage is growing at a very, very rapid pace, right? So there are some challenges and discontent against the pharmaceutical industry because cannabis is viewed as a competitor. So we have to run this business, the product development, the innovative product development, the banking infrastructure, the business infrastructure, the regulation, the compliance in a very similar fashion to the pharmaceutical space. Yet we have to maintain the organic nature and the holistic nature of the farmer market style products where we're organic, self-regulating, making sure we're ethical and creating products that meet a certain quality standard. So I believe that that is a very important personal goal of mine. This is a vision of our company at Alt. And frankly, there are certainly challenges, right? Because companies that do have the $200 million or even $50 million legacy, as you talked about, Sunday, that have that money, they're at a clear advantage on entering the space at just about any level, figuring out on allocating some of those funds and having a more advantageous situation than some of the companies like ourselves, which are very early startups and are wanting to take a very standardized route where we want to make investments with universities, do studies. Companies like, GW Pharma, for example, who allocate $500 million to a portion goes to lobbying, portion goes to universities, all that. They're clear at an advantage. Hence, us being here, talking about this to work on capital raises, to be able to execute on a very standardized process that helps the governments, the private companies create this infrastructure while we continue to create products that give the consumers a standard organic experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate that. And so I'll just say a couple of words and then we'll open it up to kind of panel questioning. It's really exciting to see consistent turnout for our events. The partnership between Bar Capital, which is focused on helping investors navigate and tie in with the quality investments and funds in the space, as well as 361 Firm, which has extended our reach to a great community of investors, operators, and other executives that have a lot of great input and are benefiting the cannabis industry through events like this. Part of the excitement is, things like safe banking, they're getting very close to happening. And so I'd love to focus on the parts that we think will pass in hopefully the nearer term and what that implies for different areas. And one of the key areas, which was already brought up in the chat, is on the social equity side. So, Chris, I guess I'll kind of open up to you, but all the panelists, you're welcome to kind of chime in. I think one thing I'll kind of level set on is most of the major MSOs in this space, they don't have a problem banking. They've reached a size where, they're able to get capital on much easier terms. But for startups, for younger companies, it has been a very big challenge, and it has stifled the growth in the industry for quite a while. And for investors, there's been a overhanging cloud in the cannabis industry. Will the federal government kind of reverse stance and go after the states or the banks that have been helping bank the space, like Sunny has talked about? So, as an opening question, Chris, if you could talk about kind of the social justice part of this, and in particular safe banking moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly hot topic right now in DC in particular. If anybody watched the press conference that Senator Schumer and Senator Booker held, at the end of that press conference, Booker really went out of his way to say that I will not support, I think he said, I will lay myself down before I allow an easy banking bill to pass that just makes these rich companies richer at the expense of social justice. And that's reflective of a debate that's been going on behind the scenes about really whether or not banking and safe banking, the Safe Banking Act does anything on the social justice side. And it's created a real rift among advocacy organizations that are working on this in DC, where you have groups, for example, like the ACLU and the Drug Policy Alliance on one side lobbying very hard to say we cannot advance a banking bill without comprehensive reform, right? It's not justice focused. It doesn't do enough for social equity. And then you have groups like the Minority Cannabis Business Association, which represents the interests of social equity, Black, brown, diverse business owners, saying we need safe banking, and this is critically important for social equity licensees. And the reason for that is you're absolutely right, Anand, that for the larger MSOs, banking is a challenge for everybody. But there are no MSOs at this point that don't have a bank account. But for smaller businesses, for mom and pop businesses, and especially for social equity operators who have traditionally had a harder time accessing banking services to begin with, it is a lot more challenging. But the bigger problem is lack of access to capital in general, and the fact that safe banking would open up traditional lending, would open up loans, would open up financial institutions to the industry. And there is no doubt about it that would benefit larger companies as well, right? The larger companies would be the first to gain access to the largest financial institutions, to huge sums of capital that are not available to them today. But right now, the biggest challenge facing equity operators, and I'm working with a few of them. I'm part of a group in that's a senior advisor to a social equity operator or licensee in Boston, Massachusetts, and I've worked with others around the country. And the biggest challenge by far is this access to capital question. And we're actually at a point now where, even though there's more capital being injected into the industry in general, more investment in the industry in general, it's actually more difficult in some ways for social equity operators to access that capital because the industry has gotten more mature. And as capital that had been sitting on the sidelines starts coming into the industry, they're typically going to be less risk averse. And so they're going to put their money in operators that have a proven track record. So existing MSOs, existing operators looking to expand, more likely than they are to put it into a new startup equity operator that has to go out and compete with these larger operators. And so we've created a situation where the states have started to do a pretty good job of figuring out how to get licenses in the hands of these disproportionately impacted communities and these equity licensees, but they have not figured out, and there really is no way for them to solve the issue of how to get these folks funded. Right? Some states have created grants programs, some loans programs, but it's a very small drop in the bucket of what's needed to get these businesses up and running. And we've created a situation where the most viable source of capital for many Black operators, brown operators, social equity operators are the MSOs themselves, because they're the ones attracting most investment, and they're now looking for additional ways to gain market share in these new markets where they may be limited on the number of licenses they're allowed to hold. So if they fund an equity licensee, they can get a shelf space agreement, right? They can get a small equity position in some cases, right? They can get management fees, right? And have other ways to get larger penetration into a market where they're otherwise constricted from doing so. And look, in some cases, those are good deals that work out well on both sides. And in some cases, they're quite predatory. But regardless of whether they're good or whether they're predatory or somewhere in between, the reality is that equity operators should have the ability to access other sources of capital if they want to go and get an SBA loan to fund their capex at 3 to 4 to 5% interest rates, which would be well below what they're getting even with good deals that they can get in the current cannabis environment from cannabis lenders or MSOs. So I'm very much of the mind that opening up banking would be a major benefit to the equity community and to equity operators. But it is a very divisive issue right now when it comes to debating these issues in DC.
Thanks, Chris. Sunday or any of the other panelists, if you have any thoughts about it?
Chris, what do you think the likelihood of SAFE passing, or what form do you think something will take? I think something will happen by the end of Biden's administration, but what's your view on what that actually looks like?
It's a great question, and I I wish I had the answer, but I'd be loath to make a prediction. I think if I had to guess, I think that because safe banking as a standalone bill has become somewhat of a political hot potato, right? I mean, Booker drew a pretty fine line there in that press conference. I think it's much more likely to happen as either an amendment or more likely even just written into either the budget or some larger either reconciliation bill or omnibus spending bill. It would be very hard for even the most progressive Democrats or Cory Booker to say, I'm going to veto this $1 trillion spending bill or reconciliation bill because it has a banking provision in it. So I think that's a way to allow folks like Booker to save face, allow it to happen, but not force those Democrats to now go on record and have to vote for or against it. Either way, they're going to take flack. So I think that's probably the way it happens if it happens. I'm not convinced that it will during the Biden administration, but if I had to put a bet on it, I would bet a small amount that it will. I think it's more likely than not, but it's by no means a slam dunk at this point.
And then on the social equity side, in terms of the federal Schumer's bill not passing, what do you think in terms of the specific elements of the policy proposal, what do you think is palatable in terms of resentencing and like the specific things that folks will say that's not what we want, but this is a real step in the right direction?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think this is actually more challenging than banking because the social equity provisions are quite unpopular among the Republican caucus by and large, whereas banking enjoys a lot of. I mean, we could pass banking with a straight up or down vote on the Senate floor. I believe we would get more than 10 Republican senators to vote for it, in large part because the American Banking Association has been supporting it, and so it's viewed by a lot of offices on the Hill as a banking bill more than a cannabis bill. Whereas, social equity provisions are very much viewed as cannabis, and they're viewed as somewhat racially charged. So I think they're more challenging to get done. That said, if you're going to get something done, again, it's going to have to be as part of a larger bill rather than a standalone. And I think the lowest hanging fruit there is probably expungement. So I think that if we're going to get anything, that's probably what we get. It's hard to see us getting a lot more than that, although I hope the Democrats make a real effort to include broader provisions, things like expanding SBA loans to minority-owned businesses, minority-owned cannabis businesses. I think that would be a tremendous help. But I think expungement is probably the sort of lowest hanging fruit here.
Yeah, and we've already seen states follow some form of that, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is expungement is much more of a state issue than it is a federal issue. It's over 90% of cannabis offenses or cannabis convictions in this country are at the state and local level, not at the federal level. The feds tend to deal with, large scale trafficking offenses. The only possession offenses that really go through the federal system are, if they take place on federal parkland or in some parts of DC or in some cases in Native American land. So it'd be great to get those off the books, obviously, but it's a small fraction of the overall conviction rate. Most of that is at the local and state level.
I have a question, perhaps for you, Chris, or anybody else can chime in. One of the things that I saw in not just California but many states, and you guys are probably aware of this, is the bills passing, the regulations coming through, but there not being enough capital by the state to create enough of a government or a task force or a team to put these regulations in effect. So there being a very big delta, a very big gap before the time comes when, for example, testing is done or what we're talking about as far as the banking goes. And I'd like a little bit of a better understanding of, even the part about expungement, right? Like how many people is each state going to allocate towards that whole program and go through that? Same thing with the banking that, okay, for the BSA, for example, as Sunday talked, how many people is the bank going to invest? They're going to charge the clients, right? They want to tax and charge the clients to create that team. So I just want to kind of understand that when this goes federal, and we're estimating that is some time from now, what does the timeline kind of look like very roughly before things are actually in action and fluid?
I mean, I can start on that one. I think others probably have thoughts here. I mean, I think it takes a while, right? I mean, things tend to not move quickly at the federal government on anything. So to think that they're going to create an entirely new, regulatory, licensing, taxation structure for something that's never been, that's never been, well, it's never been legal at the federal level, never been regulated at the federal level, I should say, was legal 100 years ago. That's going to take a long time. On the funding issue, the nice thing, I guess the silver lining is to the tax rates being so high is they should have enough funding or enough tax revenue coming in to fund this. But I think rulemaking is going to take a while. I mean, just look at what's happened with hemp, right? I mean, industrial hemp and CBD production was legalized at the federal level through the Farm Bill now 3 or 4 years ago, and they're still going through rulemaking at the federal level, and that's just dealing with CBD hemp production. If you're talking about establishing entire regulatory framework for the entire cannabis industry, in particular where you have one with this patchwork of different state laws, some states where it's still illegal, I mean, I think it's a 5 to 8 year process before this is like established and actually working. But it's, so it's going to come in piecemeal, right? I mean, some of it will be implemented faster than others, right? Expungement is not that difficult at the federal level. That's all, they just got to go through federal databases and through the federal database, and they can do that fairly easily, right? Some states have shown that states have been able to do this on their own. It might take a year or so, but that shouldn't take years. But other issues around, rulemaking and enforcement and regulation, I think that's going to be a multi-year process.
Yeah,
May I ask you a question? Sorry, I was wondering if I could just kind of ask a follow-on question to that. In terms of like those who have been expunged, what can we do as an industry and as state regulators to encourage employment within the industry for those who've been expunged, right? Because when we're talking about some of the greatest growers of all time, they really propped the plant up throughout the prohibition. They created things that never would have existed without prohibition, like green crack and AK-47 and an entire culture of cannabis. What can we do to get those who have been expunged into the industry? And how can we convince our state regulators that this is important so that we can honor the flower and the culture and all of the history that has been created from prohibition?
Listen, for weeks I've been saying that there is a lot about what is happening in the gray market that can inform a lot of these conversations. I've been saying that for weeks now.
If I could step in and answer that question directly, Todd, you raise a perfect question. And if anybody wants to reference some of my comments in the chat, it's a subject that I'm obviously dear to. Industrial hemp is our purpose. We founded a co-op this last year called HMP, which stands for Hemp Made Products. And I'm continually battered with this confused notion of the difference between hemp and marijuana. And we simply need to further distract people from the fact that they're not the same thing. And I think this is critical as far as a jobs issue, an economic development issue, reintroducing prisoners and people expunged from felonies into the economy. Industrial hemp offers myriad opportunities to both transfer the knowledge of cannabis cultivation and introduce new economic streams into any community at any size. Because, as you know, hemp as a product, as a culture, as a crop has been the first crop ever cultivated by mankind that wasn't to eat. So we have the tech. It's not high tech. It can be done in a very low tech area too, which causes a lot less financial distress and risk to outfit these new industries.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate your feedback on that. But some people don't want to come into the hemp industry. They want to be a part of the marijuana industry, right? The culture that they came up in and that we shouldn't be ashamed of. And I love hemp. Hemp was my first love. So, Chris, maybe you can give us an industry perspective from the NCI side.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you raised this question, Todd. It's incredibly important, and having been involved in this for so long, I couldn't agree more. right? I mean, those of us who enjoy cannabis and have enjoyed cannabis for a long time, and we've gotten our supplies for a long time from the illicit market growers. And I don't think that they should be, not only should they not be stigmatized for having participated in the underground economy, we should be celebrating the folks that have been creating the products that we all love and that have allowed, that allowed this industry to exist in the first place. So there's a number of ways you can do this. And I think, a lot of the focus at the state level has been on how to allow folks who have been impacted by the war on drugs or impacted by prohibition to get licenses. And that is incredibly important. And you've seen, states like California and Massachusetts and Illinois and now, New York, New Jersey have pretty good provisions in their laws to provide or to allow folks with criminal records for cannabis or who come from neighborhoods that have been disproportionately policed to get licenses. And that's incredibly important, but it's only a piece of the puzzle, right? Because the reality is only, 1% or so of the industry is going to be an owner, right? Just like in any business, right? The vast majority of the people who participate as employees, right? Participate in other ways than just owning their own business. So tremendously important to make sure that those who want to own their own business have an avenue to do that. But we also need to be doing, I think states should be providing job skills training for folks who maybe have been in the underground economy, aren't familiar with how to they're as familiar with how to operate within a legal regulated environment, to create these pipelines for employment. You've seen in New York, for example, I believe has an element of their law where they'll provide, I believe, licensing credits for businesses that hire people who were formerly incarcerated or who have cannabis convictions on their records. So you can actually financially incentivize businesses through tax breaks or breaks on their licensing fees and regulatory fees for hiring folks. I think you should be working with organizations that do skills training for formerly incarcerated individuals or who work in the communities that have been disproportionately impacted to have them provide those pipelines to employment for the industry. So there are ways that we can do this. We started to see some states kind of scratch the surface, but it is important. I guess the last piece to this that I would mention is something that a good friend of mine, Adam Smith, from the Craft Cannabis Alliance in Oregon has raised is, traditionally in the traditional markets, there has been a synergy between traditionally, black and brown inner city, call them distributors, right? Dealers, right? The people who have provided the product to the consumers who want it, and the predominantly white farmers from places like Humboldt County, Mendocino County, who have also been disproportionately targeted by law enforcement, right? The helicopter flyovers in Northern California, right? The raids, the mass arrests of growers out there. And there's been a synergy between those two groups for decades without them really knowing it, right? Because it's kind of cut off by the middlemen that bring the products from these agricultural regions to these cities where they're largely distributed. And so when we talk about how we regulate interstate commerce at the federal level and issue social equity licenses, it would be great if we could maintain this synergy and these distribution networks, by providing social equity licenses and priority social equity licenses to those traditional farmers, right, who've been growing some of the best cannabis in the world in places like Mendocino and Humboldt and the Oregon coast, as well as the predominantly people of color in cities around the country that have been distributing it, make sure that they also have access to the license and that they have first access to product that's being shipped from these traditional growers, right? It's the old sort of Steve D'Angelo Harborside adage, out of the shadows into the light. We don't need to recreate all of this and put it all of it into the hands of new businesses. We should be doing everything we can to provide pathways for those who have been doing this for decades to now do this legally and maintain that network.
Perfect.
I'd like to add one thing, a comment, and it's slightly on the topic. It will resonate well with the conversation we're having right now. I have one of my very near and dear friends. A little preface is, there's a way we're moving forward in a very progressive, hopefully an aggressive fashion, in a very organized fashion. But as we're talking, we also have to look at the past and make corrections, adjustments, and be fair to the people who have been on the front lines in a very noble fashion, right? So this is a very small story about one of my really close best friends, I would say. This guy was in the hemp space many, many years ago. This was before the 2018 Ag Bill. And he's a white male, but he happened to be in an area where he was cultivating hemp plants specifically for a very large group of patients and small underground operation for people with MS, for children with epilepsy. And this is one of the world's leading geneticists, plant breeders. And, I'm a scientist myself. I can very confidently say that this guy sits, he's in an elite class. Anyways, this is before there was local education between hemp versus cannabis. This guy was scrutinized to a point. He was put in prison for many months, and there's been no correction to that. He kept getting tossed back. There's felonies on his record. Even after the 2018 bill, this is, again, non-THC related. We can understand that, okay, if in certain areas, if it's cannabis related, it's perhaps even more difficult, right? But I'm talking hemp for a person, an elite geneticist who's actually breeding for people with very serious illnesses. Currently, he's in a position where it's very difficult for him to capitalize on any global opportunities. Companies want to work with him, but he's not able to travel because of his record. So I believe that the discussion we're having here is a very, very crucial and important component because we need to address these problems moving forward. It is very important for the industry to make these corrections.
Yeah, Jay, I think you put it in a really important way. I often tell people that we have to look at re-implementing the cannabis industry in a manner that addresses the ills that were created by this plant's prohibition. I think this is incredibly important. This is such a huge paradigm shift taking place in the midst of an inflection point in human history. And I think the folks around this table here have the opportunity to really make an impact on that. Thanks, Chris, for your comments, and thanks, Jay, for adding to that.
Thank you. And we're open for questions from the audience. And Jen, I wanted to highlight you. Thank you for, as always, for helping us find speakers for our event. If you had any comments or thoughts, feel free to jump in. And I also wanted to highlight a newer member of the community, Isaac. If you could just give a quick background on yourself and your involvement with the cannabis space, if you're still on here. Would love for you to participate as well. Do we still have Isaac? He probably had to drop off. Yeah, I believe he had to drop off. So another area I wanted to cover is, assuming this legislation creates opportunities for advancement, at least some parts of it, safe banking being one. What are some thoughts around we talked about this briefly, and Chris, again, you may be the most familiar with this, but what are some of the interstate commerce pieces of this in your kind of initial understanding, and how much pushback do you think you're going to get? Are people going to be able to ship from California to New York? Cannabis, as long as they're not crossing a state that doesn't allow it, is that potentially been thought out in the current proposal? Because what I'm always curious about is to get this fully advanced, there's a number of areas that need to kind of develop. States having choice is great. I think it'll make it easier for those that want to legalize to move ahead, and those that are culturally kind of opposed, they'll take longer, and that's fine. But in terms of cultivation, there's an oversupply on the West Coast, and obviously there's a lot more experience in growing, and the conditions are far better in the West Coast, et cetera. Is there going to be some contemplation through this process on how that will shape out?
So my understanding is, and others may have more detail on this. My understanding is that the legislation specifically allows for interstate commerce, and it prohibits a state where it is legal from prohibiting a product coming in from another legal state. So a state couldn't just be a silo and say we're only going to allow it to be grown in our state and supplied in our state, which is an interesting one because there are states out there that I think, given the opportunity, would very likely do that. I think a state like Illinois, New York, right, where you have
Missouri.
relatively small number of Missouri. Yeah, we have a relatively small number of well-capitalized players that would like to keep that market domestic or interstate to not allow cheap products coming in from the West Coast. But this does prohibit that. The question, though, is how does that work in practice, right? Because it does say that states are still allowed to keep it illegal. You could absolutely see a scenario where there's basically a wall of states, of illegal states, separating the West Coast from the eastern half of the country. If you look down the map, I mean, you could see it going, the Dakotas right down through, say, Kansas, and I don't have a map in front of me, so I can't give you the straight line, but you could very well see where there isn't a path where somebody could drive their product, or put it on a freight train or something from California or Oregon into the Midwest or the East Coast. And this does not address how that would function. I imagine that the TTB could issue licenses where if somebody were driving through an illegal state, as long as they didn't stop or unload, that it would prevent them from being arrested by local law enforcement. I'm not sure how that would work. You almost certainly could fly the product from the West Coast over an illegal state, because in that case, you're in federal airspace. You're not considered in state territory, but instead in federal airspace. And if it's federally legal, that should be allowed. But these are details that are very much to be worked out during the regulatory rulemaking process.
We do have a piece of tech, Chris, if it's of interest to anyone on the call. A partner of ours in South Texas called Hempliance has built an app, and it was originally designed for chain of custody compliance, but it's grown quite a bit from there to include everything from standard operating procedures for farmers to seed supply to a marketplace, even now to a digital coin with which to pay the farmers carbon credits just for planting, regardless of their cultivation. And that includes a connection both to the state regulators as well as law enforcement, literally in every city that the logistical chain takes place. So we definitely have an answer for it. Whether states like Idaho will ever get on board is another question. So.
Thank you. A question from, is it Istiak Doza? For me, actually, about Southeast Asia and when there might be legalization taking place there. So, interestingly enough, I had a breakfast meeting, and one of the topics was launching CBD products in India through the pharma medicinal channel. I have a network there and was traveling there quite a bit before COVID. So I think in terms of Southeast Asia and Asia in general, CBD is the play for the foreseeable future. Processing it, developing medication, and producing active pharmaceutical ingredients in the CBD space. I can't see culturally most Asian countries accepting THC until it becomes potentially legal federally in the U.S. and other Western countries, and it becomes another area to trade. And I can see culturally India, I can tell you from growing up there's a festival called Holi, and I would say probably about 200 million people consume cannabis at that event. Much of the adult population consumes cannabis in a milk-based drink, and so there's a black market that's very alive there. It's not strictly enforced against by the federal government, but it is illegal to grow it. But it grows, in many locations in India, and has for many, many generations. So I think long way away for THC. CBD is the play for the next, 5 to 10 years, in my opinion. And I'm planning on launching a THC drink for that Holi festival at some point in the future.
Anand, we can talk about that.
Yes. Question for Maddox, if you're still on there. Yes, I see you there. In terms of investment decision making, how does this proposal change anything, if at all? And how do you kind of look at potential investments in terms of there's these pockets that currently exist at the state level, for example. They might not be disrupted too soon from this, but certain business models are tied into the fact that you can be insulated in a certain geography or part of the market, and you might be in, Michigan, and you're protected because you don't really have too much competition coming in from another state. And this goes beyond just growers, but any kind of thoughts on how this might or how investors should look at this space to figure out what the implications might be of a bill like this?
So, given this bill isn't going to pass, there's probably, more psychological elements to this, but I do think it impacts the, kind of the competitive landscape. And I'd referenced this earlier, but, the well-capitalized scale players, on both parts of the supply chain, both physical and digital, I think are in a better position. I think you're going to see more capital move into the space, and they'll probably be going, that capital will be going to the category leaders, whether it's, the top MSOs or, the Janes, LeafLinks, and Dutchies. I think the customer scale in the, retail footprint and production footprint that both of those sides have, is pretty substantial. And I kind of see that continuing. I think, to Chris's point earlier, it's still going to be a while until we see federal legalization. So I think that will keep kind of traditional folks on the sidelines as it relates to, I think alcohol and beverage will start to be more. Pardon me?
Calls recorded for quality. How can I help you today?
I think we got somebody else not on mute.
I think you'll see some of the traditional kind of, technology companies. I know the different, large payments companies have been poking around this industry. PayPal made an investment in a, cannabis POS company a while back. So I think you're going to see more of that, but you're not going to see the mad rush to get in because, there's still ambiguity around the regulatory landscape, which, I think, this is probably a good moment for growth stage companies that, have the footprint, have capital, have traction. I think you'll still see earlier stage companies get funded on the technology side. On the production side, I think, there are definitely opportunities there, but from like a risk adjusted basis, the MSOs are pretty strong and they've spent the last eight years, taking bumps and bruises where they're really in a good spot to shine, I think. And then I think, if SAFE or some form of that passes, I think that, dramatically impacts some of the technology companies that will have payments as a meaningful lever to their business models. LeafLink being one that, already does that more on the, B2B side. So it's less, it's not dependent on the card networks, but they're monetizing payments there. But for the consumer marketplaces, I think, in the POS systems and kind of that side of the tech stack, the passage of SAFE will be very meaningful to the kind of monetization, potential of those business models.
Great. Thank you. Scott, I see you have your hand up. Maybe from an earlier question.
It was. Sorry about that. I'll take it.
No worries. It's the virtual hand. It stays up. Any other questions from the audience? I'm just kind of looking through the chat. I don't want to hog all the questions, so feel free to jump in. Let's see here. So in terms of exploring another avenue in the cannabis space, I see somebody else has got their hand up. If you've got your hand up, you can just jump on in and unmute and ask the question. I see VX Global.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It just does that automatically. My question is, I think I put it in the chat. What's happening in Wyoming is that there's a couple of crypto banks now that have charters that allow them access to the OCC1 federal charter so they can borrow against the Federal Reserve. And my question was, does anybody that's, know of any banks that are moving, in that direction on a state level that will allow cannabis to bank? Because one of the reasons we've stayed away from it 100%. We're now working with one client that's a brand. So that was my question was is there maybe any movement on that front that will break down the doors and maybe won't, be subject to attack by the federal government or a state?
And sorry, could you state your name and what your...
John Pappy.
Okay, great. And what is your firm involved with in terms of the cannabis space?
We typically do investment marketing. We've had multiple clients come to us on the cannabis front and turned almost 100% of them down. The only one we're working with has a CBD brand line to it, and then they're venturing into the drink lines for cannabis and grow. And so we're just trying to get our arms around that right now from a regulatory standpoint.